To the second of the two videos on Emile Durkheim's Division of Labor in Society, 1893. So, just to say, this was Durkheim's doctoral dissertation, and the man had more brain power than I did. I mean, it's an astonishing accomplishment for someone to write first crack out of the box. We're gonna finish the last two books. We're actually about halfway through the actual text right now. So just to kind of again sort of summarize where we were, we walked through, traditional societies had low social density, absolute social and moral vacuum separating each of the traditional societies from each other. If you don't separate traditional societies from each other, you get the problem with the warring gods, which is a sort of a phrase from Weber, where you wind up getting groups violating each other's sacred rule, sacred law, committing sacrilege, and then triggering this ongoing cycle of vengeance and blood feuds and so on, ultimately leading to war, because you cannot help but trigger the retribution and the desire to purge wrongdoing out of a traditional society. It's just that's what they're built to do. Their members are constantly looking for the person to to sort of get to wreak vengeance on. So you can't do it. So you have to keep the moral vacuums complete. The division of labor is very low, very fixed. It doesn't change. Gender often, race is in there too. Slavery, that kind of thing, serfdom. The consciousness that dominates is the collective consciousness, not the individual consciousness, right? The tribal consciousness, totem consciousness, village consciousness, that kind of thing. The dominant law is criminal, with punishment and with the logic of sacrilege. The relationships of the individual society tend to be altruistic. That means that the individual tends to subordinate themselves to the group. They view themselves as a member of the group first, rather than an individual. If the group survives and the group flourishes and I die, so be it. It's a good day to die. That's what it is to die with honor. Remember our earlier talk when we were doing Marx about valor and value, that you can die with valor and then be remembered in the group's mythology or remembered honorifically afterwards. To die with meaning for the group is altruism, right? So to die with valor. Greatest crime then is sacrilege and religious impurity. Dominant social unit or segments. Cultural mode is sacred and religious. Temporality tends to be cyclical. A conservative sort of cultural bent where you're trying to preserve and protect against change and outside influences and so on. And the guarantor of solidarity, the thing that makes sure that the society is actually bonded and welded together, bolted together, ritual worship, and the collective punishment of deviance. And participating in these two things is what realizes solidarity both for the older members of the group and for those who are young and being socialized into it. When you get into a society that's much more organically bonded together, a modern society, social density tends to get much higher, population gets much denser, and then the diversity of values and ways and gods and ways of life and so on get much more dense. Social and moral vacuums vanish. You can't maintain them. It becomes impossible not to see people committing sacrilege against your way. And you have to learn to be tolerant of that. That's the essence of organic solidarity. Toleration of diversity, toleration of other people's way of life, and recognition that not everyone is going to operate according to the same coding of sacredness that you do, right? So something like a liberal order, freedom of religion, freedom of belief, and so on. And that's again, it's necessary. It's not just a moral thing that's good for for children to learn in school, but it actually is necessary because we need people to be able to accomplish diverse ends and to contribute. We need their work, we need their labor, and so we need them to be able to behave and act as they need. So I respect your need to do what you need to do to instrumentally complete your task. You need to respect mine, and that leads to different ways of life and different values and so on. All right, so the division of labor then is very detailed and changes very rapidly. Consciousness that dominates is the individual consciousness, not the collective consciousness. The dominant law is contract and restitution, damages, rather than crime and punishment. Relationship with the individual society tends to be egoistic. You tend to think of yourself as an individual first, individual rights, an individual journey, an individual path through the world, as opposed to altruism. So you're going to have more tendency to preserve yourself rather than to sacrifice yourself for the group, that kind of thing. Greatest and that again in an organically bonded society itself benefits when people do that, when they actually look after their own interests and pursue their own ends. That leads to a good outcome, a productive outcome for society. At least that's the argument. The greatest crimes, civil rights, are violations of civil rights and the cult of the individual. Violating that is really the new modern form of sacrilege. Everything else sort of declines. Crime sort of goes away. The collective consciousness weakens. Dominant social unit is an organ and an organic system. So it's a specialized unit that engages in some sort of specialized activity. Cultural mode is rational and secular instead of religion. Temporality is linear and progressive. So the present is different from the past, and it's going to be different in the future, and that's normal, and that's just the way things are, right? So that you lose that kind of paranoid conservatism that would have been typical of prior systems, of mechanically bonded systems. The guarantor of solidarity then is contracts, contractual fulfillment, and something like workplace ethics, and then ultimately then something like an order of law that keeps contracts fulfilled and then enforces them. So we're living in a world then, according to Durkheim, where these kind of ways of life, hordes, clans, totems, tribes, villages, clans, and tribes, right, are becoming less common, and mechanically bonded groupings are losing out economically, socially, politically, militarily, and numerically to organically bonded societies. So towns, cities, metropolis, and global modernity. The modern way of life is all about organic solidarity. And it doesn't mean that mechanical solidarity goes away altogether. It doesn't. But that the dominant mode of life is one that emphasizes, the organic bond. Okay. So, all right. So, book 2, Causes and Consequences and Conditions of the Division of Labor. All right, so he begins the second section of the book with this analysis of happiness. And he just says, look, you're not going to be happy in modernity. It's not a world of happiness. People were happier in the good old days, right? Merry old England was displaced by a rotten new industrial England, right? The Dickensian England of poverty and pauperism and workhouses and and Scrooge and Tiny Tim and all this kind of thing. That is not merry old England, right? So happiness, village fates, the world of pleasant little villages and so on, if that ever existed, goes away. And so he argues that, look, modernity, it has an increased division of labor, but it doesn't have increased happiness. And then he sort of recapitulates his argument in the book Suicide, where he argues, look, this is normal in modernity. We can't resist it. It's going to happen. Suicide is it is that in essence, this is a suicidogenic zone. Europe and capitalist Europe. Cities have more suicides than rural areas do. Germany and France has more than some of the other less developed countries. Suicides of areas of development. Learned professions have more suicides, for example, than agricultural peasant workers and that kind of thing. Men have more suicides than women. This is still true to this day. Oh, it's interesting. I just was reading this, that women actually have more suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. That men tend to use guns and actually accomplish. One of the arguments for those who would like to see gun control is that it would take guns away from impulsive suicidal acts. Okay, but just this basic idea that those who are drawn in Durkheim's world. So Durkheim argued men are drawn into the world of modernity more so than women, who tend to remain home and raise children, at least in 1895 or 1893 Paris. And therefore, because they're immersed in organically bonded modern society, they're less happy and they commit suicide more. And that's normal, okay? So, so the division of labor isn't caused by the desire for human happiness or hedonism and that kind of thing. If it is, it's really wrong-sided. He said it's really just caused by necessity. So Durkheim here is going to make a very structural argument. He's going to claim that the reason why society develops a division of labor, that it happens outside of anyone's plan. There's no one who plans this. And very few people want it, right? Most people don't want it, but it happens nevertheless, and everyone participates in it. So he's giving here one of the great sort of analyses of the social unconscious, which is what social structure is. So in sociology, this is what we do. We study the unconscious forces that propel people into patterned social life. It happens again. We talked about it in Marx. Value happens behind the back. It happens without anyone's real conscious awareness. But nevertheless, you do it anyway, right? So he's going to argue that there are unconscious forces that take place. We can identify them. We can consciously articulate them. But for the people who are caught up in these forces, they don't see them. They don't experience them consciously. They just know that the way of life that they want to live is impossible, and they have no choice but to specialize in some urban profession. They can't go back to the farm. They can't go back to the peasant village. They can't go back to the tribe. It's gone. It's been blown away. It's collapsed. And so without desire for participation in division of labor, people nevertheless do it. And once it gets established, and once you get sort of attuned to a world of relative individuality, relative individual freedom, again, a division of labor, specialization, and so on, it's very hard, possibly impossible, for us who are fully immersed in the modern world to go back to something else. As William James, the great American progressive psychologist, wrote about 120 years ago, once you've tasted freedom, you don't want to give it up, right? And that once you live in a world where your individual talent and taste can be developed, and you can find networks of affiliation, and you can find vocations and avocations that allow you to explore aspects of your personality and self, you don't want to go back to being a peasant, right? And so to Durkheim, again, this happens unconsciously, but it nevertheless is kind of a one-way street. And again, without the individual desire, without even a conscious awareness of why these forces are occurring, the division of labor happens nevertheless. We move into organic solidarity. Modernity happens without anyone really wanting it. Okay? So why does it happen? Number one, the disappearance of the moral vacuums. The moral vacuums go away. So once you get a certain level of social density and population density, diversity is laid on top of each other, and people start violating each other's sacred order. And as people begin to violating the sacred order, they either kill themselves or they say, look, you do your thing, I'll do mine. There is no one right way to live. There's my one right way to live. You want to live some other way? Go to it. It's yours, right? You develop up the space of individuality, the space of liberty, right? So something like, again, individual autonomy, liberalism in the sense of being free to do what you need, free to pursue your own ends, that kind of things is a consequences of this density. So population density due to geographic concentration in crowded cities, urbanization and town movements, right? People go from the rural areas to the towns. Increased communication technology that bonds people together, coordinates more, and that kind of thing. Eliminates social and moral vacuums even when people don't move, right? So rural areas still wind up becoming modern in the modern world, even if they're geographically separated because of newspapers and television and social media and that kind of thing. So the result is that you get a multiplication of intersocial relationships, and therefore, again, these little moral vacuums that used to separate it, these white spaces separating villages, clans, and tribes fill in, and as they fill in, right, and become linked together, right, you get a whole bunch of more villages, clans, and tribes growing on top, you lose those moral vacuums, and suddenly, again, you're confronted with either the necessity of killing each other because you're all violating each other's sacred order, right? Or you submit to something like a liberal constitution and law, and you pacify and accept a liberal order and the rule of law, and you no longer kill each other for religious violations and so on. So in modern society, the social vacuums disappear with increased density and increased volume of human beings. So with growth and density, societies necessitate a division of labor. You can't live without it. And partly because you've blown away the social vacuums that would have made living in isolation possible. Page 280 talks about the Darwinian struggle for existence. Again, that if everybody tries to live as a farmer in the middle of increasing density, you just start fighting together and kill each other over land and resources. Instead, if some people remain farmers and other people become bakers and lawyers and millers and that kind of thing, you get a division of labor, you get a kind of an ecological diversity, a specialization. Then you can have increased You can have cooperation instead of conflict, and you can have something like a highly developed economy and peaceful coexistence instead of war. And then to Durkheim, look, this is what morality is. Morality, each one of these butcher, baker, candlestick maker connections is a moral connection, right? And that is his argument for why the moral order is actually denser and stronger in the modern world than it was in traditional society. Because we are actually cooperatively interdependent in a biophysical way. We really do need each other. The reciprocal need for each other's labor is what organic solidarity is. It's not the contracts. It's the fact that we actually need it. So page 213 is a summary of that. The division of labor increases intelligence. It increases reason. It increases reality testing in the Freudian sense. It increases the analytic grasp of workers over the task that they do. It increases their instrumental reason, quite honestly. And economists argue that the division of labor is defined by increased production of goods. For Durkheim, that may well be true, but the division of labor is defined for him by increasing morality, increasing intelligence, increasing adaptability, increasing strength of society, increasing freedom, and so on. Right. So page 224. There's an interesting footnote on England as an abnormal form of the division of labor. So see the end of the book as well, book 3, with the detailed economic disease of labor, with segment. So there's a segmentary a social order in England yet. The division of labor skims the surface of society, but remember, like the old class order, the old caste order continues. There's all kinds of what, Pierre Bourdieu called, cultural capital that existed yet within Britain, having the right language, the right accent, the right manners, the kind of thing that only those who have breeding, they called it breeding, right? Only those who had upper class breeding were selected for upper class positions. And so, the division of labor sort of skimmed across the surface. So a lot of working class people with Cockney accents would have remained working class or even lumpen proletariat. The middle class would have had, again, sort of the manners and morals of like the Quakers or the Pietists or even the Puritans, but those upper class positions remained very resistant to the division of labor. So it wasn't a fully modern society for a whole bunch of other reasons too. So chapter 3 of book 2, then, he writes about the secondary factors that cause the division of labor and organic solidarity. He writes about the progressive indeterminacy of the collective consciousness and its causes. So what he argues is that the gods become very vague, that the thou shalts and thou shalt nots become kind of like guidelines instead of absolute moral prohibitions. You get a diversity of religion, you get a diversity of interpretations of religion. You get, again, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, and that means that the collective consciousness loses its clarity, becomes multi-headed, right? You almost get like multiple